everyone. In this session, we'll be dealing with postcolonial writings, and this is a paper for your second semester MA English. And in this lecture, I'll be dealing with poetry, and this is section A poetry. And here we'll be going through 13 authors and 14 poems like A.K. Ramanujan's Self-Portrait, Dom Murray's A Letter and another poem, Sinbad, Senger's New York, Gabriel O'Hara's The Mystic Drum, David Diop's Africa, Alan Carnow's House and Land, A.D. Hope's Australia, Jack Davis' Aboriginal Australia, Margaret Atwood's Journey to the Interior, Derek Walcott's Ruins of a Great House, E. Tian Hong's Arrival, Alamgir Hashmi's So What If I Live in a House Made by Idiots, Kamoa Braithwaite's Meters. So these are the poems we'll be dealing in this session. Now let's see the poem Self-Portrait. Now before getting into the poem, let's have a look at the poet A.K. Ramanujan. His full name is Attipattu Krishnaswamy Ramanujan, and he lived from 1929 to 1993, and in some works you will see that he died around 1995. Now, he was a well-known poet, folklorist, scholar, playwright, and philologist. And like most other poets writing in English, he was a bilingual. He writes both in Kannada and in English. A.K. Ramanujan's art is almost perfect, but when you look at his poetic output, it's very thin. He has to his credit only two slender volumes of poetry, and these collections are known as The Striders, which was published in 1966, and Relations Poems, it was published in 1971. And there is another collection, Select Poems, which was published in 1976, which contains a selection of poems from both these volumes. Now, by these volumes, it means The Striders and Relations. From these collections, he selected certain poems and published it under the title Select Poems, which was published in 1976. Besides all these, he's also an excellent translator, and his forte is translation into English from Kannada and Tamil. So, besides being a good poet or an excellent poet, he was also an excellent translator, and he translated into English from Kannada and Tamil. Now, his well-known translations include 15 Tamil poems, which was published in 1965, The Interior Landscape, which was published in 1967, Speaking of Shiva, which was published in 1972, and Samskara, which was published in 1976. Now, it was he who brought U.R. Anandamurthy's Samskara into international, acknowledgement, or it was given international credit by translating it into English in 1976. So it was he who brought the work Samskara by U.R. Anandamurthy into international fame. Okay. Towards the end of his life, Ramanujan turned his attention to another rich area of Indian life and culture, and that is folklore. And based on this folklore traditions, he wrote a work, Folk Tales from India, and that was published in 1994. And it's a selection of oral narratives from 22 Indian languages. So this is an important contribution by Ramanujan. And his poetry is known for its irony and ambiguity. So that's the feature of his poetry. And he also uses his experience as an expatriate to interrogate the values of both the motherland India and the adopted country USA. So he often used his experience as an expatriate to interrogate the values of both his motherland India and his adopted country USA. Now let's go through the poem Self-Portrait, and this short poem, which consists of 9 lines, is from his collection, The Striders, which was published in 1966. Now, here, this poem is rather puzzling, and also it's even a bewildering poem. And this is one of Ramanujan's most obscure poems so far as the reader is concerned. And in this poem, he talks about the struggle of modern man for identity in a world of materialism and capitalism. Now, in what way the speaker in the poem sees in a mirror is not his own but a stranger's reflection, and it is not clear to us whether he sees his own reflection or a stranger's reflection. And then, what does he mean by saying that his father had often signed his name in a corner? Now, when you look, or when you read the poem, you understand all these questions, or you will come across all these questions. All that we can make of this poem is that the speaker is unable to identify or recognize himself, and that his reflection in a mirror in some way reminds him of his father, and the speaker is not able to portray himself and his personality in definite terms. Now, that is the main concern of the speaker. And he finds something of everybody in his personality. That is, he finds everybody's some traits in his personality. And of course, he finds in his personality something of his ancestors and more particularly of his father. So, this is what this poem is all about in short. Okay, so in this poem, you find his identity crisis and his quest for identity or his quest for recognition whatsoever. Now, like we said, the quest for material things makes him forget himself, and you know that he moved to US, and he is not different from the modern man who has lost his identity as well, because he has some traits of his own native land, and also he definitely has the influence of the place where he is living at that moment. So throughout this poem, he is trying to discover his original self, and the poet is also trying to put down Western culture, which is materialistic, and he rather prefer Eastern culture, which leads to the discovery of himself. So this is the impression you get when you read the first part of the poem. And towards the end of the poem, he attacks the patriarchal society of the East as his identity was given to him by his father. So he says that uh, his identity is not defined by him; it's defined by his father for him. So he feel a kind of identity crisis there. So, in short, we can say that this poem is the best example for identity crisis, and this poem is also written in free verse style, and this is in first person narration. And like I said, there are only 9 lines, and this can be also considered as an autobiographical poem. And when you look at the poem, you see that the poem began in a dissatisfied tone, and by the end, he rediscovered his identity. Society also values a person through his identity. So, this point you come across towards the middle of the poem. So, in the beginning, or the first line, shows the quest for identity, and he sees himself through others, and this implies loss of individuality. So, when you read the poem, the first line itself is interesting because he says, I resemble everyone but myself. So, that itself shows his quest for identity because he sees himself through others, and this implies the loss of individuality. And sometimes it's rather confusing whether he mean I mean uh, by those lines whether he mean that he really resembles other people, or is a stranger for himself. So that question is also there. And the image of window glass is also important in this poem, and because it symbolizes the capitalist world, spread by the Western world, and in a way symbolizes the attitude, character, or identity built by capitalist possessions. So that is also very important. That window shopping, the concept of window shopping, it is a part of capitalistic world. Now, towards the end, you see date unknown. There is a usage by the poet, that is, he talks about uh, signing the poem, and he says that date is unknown, and that refers to the poet's inability to find his original self. Just like the sculptor who inscribes his signature on the sculpture, the poem is also signed in a corner, but without the date. And now this signature can be interpreted in two ways. One could be like he discovered his identity, and the second way could be that his identity is created by his father. So this could be the interpretation of the signature. So one is he discovered his identity, and the second one is his identity is created by his father. So in an Indian society, a child is known through his father, because at the end of your name there will be the name of your father. Like your second name will be the name of your father. So if everyone believes that the child's name should bear his or her father's name. So in an Indian society, thus a child is known through his father. Very rarely you find mother's name, and that too deliberately people do like that. But otherwise, it's always the name is always a child's name always bear his or her father's name. Now this shows the dominance of patriarchy in India. And also, when you closely look at the poem, you feel that you can see that the meaninglessness of life is also portrayed throughout this poem. And the major themes discussed in the poems are the struggle of modern man for identity, and self estrangement is also a recurrent theme here. And he also tries to discover his original self towards the end. And also, the fusion of cultures can be seen in this poem. So, self portrait is a very important and interesting poem. Okay. So we can say that this poem, when you put it differently, is one that through its gestures of self-denial suggest a avowal of a different kind. Now, what is this self is in the modernist fashion never stated. Now, instead, through denials and evasions, an escape from the official self is effected throughout this poem. So you can read it in this way also. The portrait of himself drawn by his father is that of a stranger, or in other words, the real Ramanujan is different from what his father intended, or even what Ramanujan's image in the glass suggests. So you can also read this poem in this way, that is, the portrait of himself drawn by his father is that of a stranger, maybe like that. Or, in other words, the real Ramanujan is different from what his father intended, or even what Ramanujan's image in the glass suggests. So, in that way, we can say that the whole poem is for on the quest for identity, and the other important theme is meaninglessness of life, or estrangement, self estrangement. Okay, so with that, we come to the end of the poem, Self Portrait. Now, let's see Domores, a letter, and Sinbad. Now, before getting into the poem, let's have a look at Domore's life. That is, he was living from 1938 to 2004. His full name is Dominic Francis Murray. He was born in Bombay into a Roman Catholic family. He was a Jewish poet, and it's said that he became very famous at a young age. And his father was Frank Murray. He was a well-known journalist and editor. His mother was Beryl de Monte. She was a doctor, and her mental breakdowns and violence influenced or affected Dombore's life, and he obsessively revisited about this in his poetry and prose. And like I said earlier, he began writing at the age of 10, and 3 years later, he published his first book. It's a collection of essays on cricket, and it was titled Green in the Grass. His first book of poems was titled A Beginning. It appeared when he was 19 years old. And this collection or this book of poems won him the prestigious Hawthornden Prize. He also published two more collections before running into a writer's block, which lasted for about 15 years. And later you can see that he published, when you look at his contribution to literature, you can see that he published 10 volumes of poems, two of translations from Hebrew, and more than 20 books of prose. So, this was his contribution to uh, literature. Now, between the assured romanticism of this early poem and the stripped down sonnets of his last work, so between these two, After the Operation is a work written by him, and there occurred, and this was like a world of travel, prose writing, resurgence, and regret. So this was the emotions which came up in this work. Now, when you look at his life, you can see that he traveled with his father throughout Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, Australia, New Zealand, etc. And he has written two important autobiographies. They are My Son's Father, which was published in 1968, and Never at Home, which was published in 1992. And he died in Bombay in 2004. So, this is a very short overview of Dom Murray's life. And when you look at his writing, you can see that uh, you can see a divided self in his writings. That is, he was brought up in an anglicized family, and also at the same time, he felt completely alienated from Indian culture, as if he was an Englishman in India. So, this disconnect from his motherland uh, and assimilating into Indian culture was virtually impossible for him, and that there was a struggle throughout his life. He remained a victim of a minority complex in both countries, both in his motherland and India, and he was never able to ascertain a cultural identity. So that emotion could be seen in his poetry. Okay, now let's get into the poem Sinbad. Now, as you all know, Sinbad is one of uh, uh, his one of important poems, and this poem describes his journey in life. And here, Sinbad, the word Sinbad or the title Sinbad, referred to a character in the Arabian Nights. It's a story, I mean, 101 stories of Arabian Nights. So, there, Sinbad is the sailor, and in that work, his name is spelled as Sindbad. And he dominates a cycle of seven stories in the Arabian Nights. And in the story, Sinbad appears as a merchant, a prominent citizen of the prosperous and glamorous Baghdad of Caliph Harun al Rashid. Okay, it said that he appeared as a merchant. So, and in his old age, this person shares the narratives of his seven voyages with a circle of friends and acquaintances, and he speaks of his travel in strange lands, the adventures and the mishap that befell him in the course of these journey. So he was talking about his adventurous voyages along with his circle of friends and acquaintances, and how the customs and ceremonials of people he met were done, and the strange and terrifying dangerous creatures he encountered, such as great birds known as the roc and whales that was mistaken for an island. So, such experiences were shared by Sinbad in Arabian Nights. So, with that influence, Dom Moray wrote Sinbad. Now, in this poem, the poem addresses Sinbad and his experiences over the sea. But here, Domore is symbolically referring to the eventful life he led and the weird and adventurous experiences he had met in his life. So, in a way, Domore is comparing himself with Sinbad. So, we can say that his autobiography is fused with Sinbad's. You can see this line in the poem, flying over defunct countries. So we can say that his thoughts are turning towards the notion of home, and the speaker of this poem tries to counsel Sinbad. So this is what he is trying to narrate throughout this poem. Now, this poem has five stanzas, and we can just have a short glimpse of what's happening in these five stanzas. Now, in the first stanza, here the poet is narrating the experience of Sinbad, various experiences of Sinbad during his voyages. And like we discussed in the beginning, Sinbad had already gone through seven voyages, and those were through turbulent seas, tempestuous conditions, and it had ended up in losing many of his companions. And he in the first stanza he is narrating the nature of Domore is trying to depict his um, the seriousness or the um, difficulty of the voyage, or the difficulty or the strange experience he had while he was traveling. So it said that he always wanted to travel one voyage after another voyage, and that too to different places. That was his aim. So in this stanza, Domore is trying to depict his hybrid identity and his own rootlessness. And he also compares himself with the legendary sailor Sinbad, because it said that Domore also had various kinds of experiences in his life, and he's trying to incorporate the sea he had explored to his life. So he is, in a way, trying to talk about his own life. So he's not able to separate himself from the voyages, and the seas tows his memories like the fellow mariners of Sinbad, whom he had lost in his dangerous adventures. So in the first stanza, here the poet is narrating the experiences of Sinbad during his voyages, and indirectly, Domore is talking about himself and his life experiences. Now, in the second stanza, the speaker of the poem explains about the weird experiences he had. Okay, weird experiences he had uh, while traveling through the sea or during his voyages. And he says that he was taken, Sinbad was taken to a diamond island, but that immense wealth cost him his own companions. That is, he says that the speaker says that Sinbad's trip led him to defunct countries which are colorless and bleak. So they traveled a lot, and some at one point they reached a defunct country, and his adventurous spirit leads him to unknown islands and draws map with raw colors. And he is the first explorer ever to step on those strange nameless countries. So what the speaker is trying to say is that Sinbad sails over different countries which are not active, or the countries which no longer exist. For that, he has to draw his own maps with his own colors, because the rest of the world is unaware of it. So here in this stanza, the poet is trying to talk about his own alienation from the world he lives in. So he says that though he is living in a country or in a place, he himself feel alienated from that world. And that's what he is trying to refer to when he's talking about different countries. Now, in the third stanza, the speaker talks about the learnings that Sinbad had through his different voyages. And he says that his journey taught the value of true friends, and because sometimes friends becomes foe, and sometimes strangers become um, friends, or that's how that is we say that a friendship turns into a stranger, and a stranger sometimes become a friend. So that kind of value of relationship or value of true friends was he was able to understand through these different voyages. And then there is a reference to bronze bees, and with this he refers to the wrong friendships, and they are compared to that of icing on a cake. Okay, which means outwardly or outside they show love, but they don't have any kind of affection inside their heart. So that is known as bronze beasts. So apart from that, Sinbad also had come across cold cups of kindness from unexpected quarters in his voyages, and these are some of the learnings Sinbad had during his voyages. That is, it said that when you travel with some of your friends or some of your acquaintances, you understand the real value of friendship and who is your real friend and who is your real foe. In order to understand this, it's better that you go for a journey along with your acquaintance or your friends. So during the journey, you'll understand who is your true friend and who is the foe. So such an experience he had from uh, his different voyages. And in the fourth stanza, he gives pieces of advice to Sinbad. The speaker is giving advice to Sinbad, and asks him to choose his own ways. And also, he also asks them to choose his own direction and follow his own truth, which means to follow his heart. Now, the speaker also asks him to choose his own friends and teammates and to stay with them. He also asks to lose his own shadow, which means here shadow uh, uh, could be referring to uh, his own beliefs, customs that he had inherited from his own community, etc. So he says that for undertaking a journey, it's better to shed all the traditions because it's of no use when you die. And he also uses a term, the last bird, and that refers to death. That is, when death puts you down, it is the end of the life and nothing can be done thereafter. So, what is the desirable? What is desirable is that choose your rock, sea mates, and then stay with it, as well as lose all the shadows that are there with you because it is of no use. So, he says that when you are traveling, when you're taking dangerous paths, the only thing which you have to face is death. So you don't have any escape from death at that point of time. So better you follow your heart. You do whatever you like, so that you can uh, understand what you want and what you don't want. Okay, so he says that, and here the poet advises Sinbad to go ahead in his life without being tied up to anything in life, be it tradition or customs or whatever it is. And he also asked Sinbad, the speaker asked Sinbad to follow his aim and his direction along with his true companion. So, whenever you are going for an adventurous journey or voyage, you should go along with your true companions. And again, the poet says, or the speaker says that Sinbad, the sailor, carried away by the immense bird, and that is an obvious symbol for the poet as world travelers, isolated, exiled, ill at ease in a home that is not his home. So, this is what he says. And in the last stanza, the speaker says that when you burn and destroy the walls, you lose your identity. So you lose your identity when you burn and destroy the walls, means when you destroy the walls of tradition or your boundaries or restrictions, you lose your identity. And it means that when you transcend boundaries, it defaces you. You become defaced. And it means that you lose your identity that connects you to a particular place, community, or tradition, and thus become universal. So here the poet concludes by saying that some of us never know home, which means we don't have our own community or tradition or a particular place. Thus, we are becoming universal, and it means that since you let go of your boundaries, you never know home as you travel to the places where the wind takes you. So be if you are not sticking to a particular custom or tradition or a place, you become universal. So in short, we can say that this poem depicts Domini's search for identity, his sense of rootlessness, and his love for embracing varieties and multiplicities of life. So this is what he tries to explain through the poem Sinbad. So Sinbad is a very interesting poem. It's an adventurous poem. It talks about voyages, and this title itself is a reference to a character in Arabian Nights. Okay, now with that we come to the end of Sinbad, and next let's see a letter. Now, a letter is a poem that was published in Poems in 1960, and this poem is an existential poem. It draws on Dom Moray's biographical experiences, and in a way, when you look at the tone of the poem, it is more personal and intimate than his other poems. Okay, and also he in this poem he recounts his struggle with anxiety and despair stemming from his inability to find a cultural identity. Like when you go through his biography, you find that he had an identity crisis or lack, because he was in a complex situation whether to stick on to his homeland or Indian culture, etc. So that could be seen in his works as well. Okay, and now he and how this results in a sense of alienation, deeply characteristics of modernist writers. So that's what you find in this poem, a letter. It's almost autobiographical and it's a long poem. And in this poem begins, that is, Domore begins this poem by establishing a setting where the speaker feels alienated. And this poem is set in India, where uh, the class and caste divides are set in stones and creates rift in society. So, the setting of this poem is India, and here you know that class and caste divides are very rampant and widespread. Okay, and you know that this class and caste divides create rifts in the society as well. Now you can see the description of hot verandas where chauffeurs drowse, and this evokes the imagery, concrete imagery of a tropical heat so intense that it drives people to sleep. So you might have seen the taxi wallas sleeping in their car. I mean, waiting for the I mean the people and customers, but if they don't find anyone, if they don't get any trip, they sleep in the car themselves, sweating in a tropical heat. So that situation is being described here, and this immediately suggests the poet's um, own unease and discomfort with the land of his birth, and this leads to an overall rejection of all it contains. And this poem also conveys to the readers that he grew up on the advantaged end of a class spectrum, and his backyard is also described as a ragged thorn's dominion. And here, thorn is a threatening symbol of danger, and it has complete control over a backyard that is supposed to be his dominion. So, so he clearly explains his house in India, what is happening in India, and how society see people, etc. So, ragged also recalls people of a low class. So, when you hear the term rag, it recalls people of a lower class because they don't have much money to buy good clothes and all. And with the tone suggesting they have the capacity to hurt and revolt against their masters. So, this is how he explains different strata or different sections of the society, advantage or the privileged section of the society, and the low, the people or the lower class people who are disadvantaged in every way. So he says that they can even hurt their or revolt against their master. So though they are rat, they're so powerful that they can behave like a thorn in order to attack their masters. And the home is overrun with these people who have established their dominion in a space that is meant to be his space of comfort. So, such people work there, and that's why it said that the home is overrun with these people who have established their dominion in a space that is meant to be his space of comfort, which could be kitchen or courtyard, etc., where they clean and do necessary stuffs. Now, um, and you can also see that his house is run by nameless servants, and that also indicates the distance and lack of personal connections between him and those in his house. And interestingly, he also refers to it as his father's house, and that also indicates he has not adopted it as his own. Now, the description again, so we can say that the whispering of the lower class is almost implicated in the separation of his parents. And after his leaving his home, the description of poems growing like maggot in his head. It's the line taken from the poem, and that suggests he began to write poetry as a means of catharsis. Now you know what is catharsis? It's purgation of emotion. Now, his poems were not beautiful and aesthetic or beautiful, but emotionally complex. So, though his poems were not beautiful and aesthetically strong, it was emotionally complex. Now, just as maggots consume flesh, the flesh of his thoughts was devoured by his poetry, and it seems ironic that poetry, a form so artistic and precise, has such animalistic association. So he is comparing his poetry to a maggot, that is, the flesh of his thoughts was tasted or devoured by his poetry. And again, you can see that he is trying to highlight the traumas of his childhood through his poetry. And it said that his poems helped him cope up with the situation. When I discussed about his biography, I talked about his mother's mental illness, and she ended up violent so much times, and that affected his life. So poetry was the only solace he had then. And again, you can see the image of both green and dung smeared plains in his homeland, and that depicts a contrast between beauty and ugliness, entirely reflective of elements of his life that were both beautiful and ugly in his birth country. And it also shows the simultaneous revulsion and attraction he feels, indicates his complex relationship with India. So, through this poem, when you closely observe, you find a complex relationship that Domore shared with India. And then, when the poem began, um, the initial setting was India. Now the setting of the poem changes to England. And although the speaker migrates for a new beginning, he despairs at the still powerful sense of isolation. And his description of life in England as an infant trips Infant strip, where many knew to walk, represents his frustration at his own inexperiences and vulnerability in contrast to others who were accustomed to the rhythm of life. So his description of life in England represents his frustration at his own inexperiences and vulnerability. So that's very important because he often um, criticized himself for the complex relationship he shared with the country or with the land where he lived and with the land where he belonged to. And he also uses pathetic fallacy to highlight his sense of despair, and he uses the verb choices. He uses the verb choice of him, that is tumbling doubly, and that indicates his lack of control in creating an exasperated sense of helplessness. And the gloom of English rain is reflective of his bleak and desolate outlook on life. And interestingly, the cold English rain is the antithesis to the hot Indian sun, and yet he feels comfortable in neither setting. So he is not comfortable in England nor in India. And this represents his inability to find the comfort and solace of home in either England or India. So a kind of dilemma exists throughout his life. Now, the images of English valleys, which are full of death, being too wild and too wild, suggest he is both too restrained and too uncontrolled. And the binary opposition between freedom and restraint again reflects his sense of this strong sense of this. His sense of strongly reflected emotions in his poems. And we can say that a letter portrays anguish as an essential element in the natural order of life, and it paves way for renewal and emergence of hope. So, in a way, we can say that there is a turning point in this poem towards the end, and it is when the speaker begins to find solace in the advice of an older poet. And by the end of the poem, the poet's despair finally shifts to envying but peaceful resignation, and he finally accepts a life where he can only experience this love as an idealist dream. With this conclusion to the poem, Moray conveys the power of despair to the reader, both as a catalyst for change and for the acceptance of a new reality. So he says that always a life becomes meaningful when there is a ray of hope. Okay, so that's what he is trying to convey. That is, Domare conveys the power of despair to the reader, both as a catalyst for change. It's like it acts like a catalyst for change, and also for the acceptance of a new reality. So that's what he is trying to explain through the poem, a letter, and it's a very interesting poem which touches our heart, which also um, touch our emotions. Okay, so that's all about the poem, a letter. Now, next is a poem uh, to the New York, and it's written by Leopold Senger. He lived from 1906 to 2001. Leopold Seder Senger is his full name, and he was a Senegalese poet, politician, and cultural theorist, and he was associated with the Negritude movement. Okay, and he was the founder of the Senegalese Democratic Bloc Party. Senger's political and literary careers were indistinguishably connected. That is, both his literary career and political life is connected. And he was also an African socialist, and that's why he was associated with the negritude movement. And he wrote poems of resistance in French, which engaged his Catholic spirituality as well as his Senegalese heritage. Now, Senghor is the author of several collections of poetry, which includes Chants d'Ombres 1945, Nocturnes, which was published in 1961, and the collected poetry, which was published in 1991, and later it was translated by Melvin Dixon. And he also edited an anthology of work by African poets in French colonies in 1945. And for that, there was an introduction which was written by Jean Paul Sartre. His non-fiction works includes numerous volumes on politics, sociology, philosophy, and linguistics. And also, Senghor was co-founded with Aim Seizure, the Negritude movement, and it promoted distinctly African cultural values and aesthetics in opposition to the influence of French colonialism and European exploitation. So Senghor co-founded with Aim Seizure, the Negritude movement, which promotes distinctly African cultural values and aesthetics instead of or in opposition to the influence of French colonialism and European exploitation. He also co founded the journal Presence Africaine with Diop, that is Elion Diop. And it said that Senghor was the first African who was invited to join the academic franchise, uh, and he was awarded honorary doctorates from 37 universities, apart from other literary acknowledgements he received from for his contributions. So this is all about him, and you can also see that he died at his home in France at the age of 95, and he is regarded by many as one of the most important African intellectuals of the 20th century. So this is all about Leopold Senghor. Now let's see the poem To the New York, and this poem is written in three sections. Now this was published in his fourth collection of poetry, Ethiopic, Ethiopics. And New York is a short poem in three single stanzas, um, stanza sections by uh, the poet, that is by Senghor. And this is dedicated to jazz orchestra and trumpet solo. Okay, and it also asserts that positive black cultural values can contribute to the automated, industrialized, but dehumanized West. So, in now this poem is written in a very interesting way, and you know that New York is a commercial as well as the capital of America, and it stands as a symbol of financial stability and exponential growth. And now, the poet Senghor exclaims that he was captivated at the beauty of New York, but it was restricted to physicality of the great long-legged golden girls. Now, he seems to be wary at the first sight of the city of skyscrapers. Initially, it was because of his inferiority complex, as the city was beyond his imagination. Secondly, as he could not confront the blue metallic ice. Now, the blue metallic eyes, or the metallic, the word adjective metallic has numerous meaning or implication. It could mean the lifelessness of the eyes, or it may indicate the nerve of steel, or it might point to the frigidity of the eyes, etc. So that is what he was trying to say about this poem. So this poet was wary at the first sight of the city of Scapus because of two things. One is his inferiority complex, as the city was beyond his imagination. Secondly, as he could not confront the blue metallic eyes. Now, this in this poem, the poet talks about many things. That is, in section 1, the persona explains why he was at first sight bewildered by New York's beauty. So, why he was, I mean, bewildered or wonderstruck by New York's beauty, and here he renders New York as both awe inspiring and emotionally bankrupt. So he is trying to portray the darker side of New York. And in section 2, a praise song to Harlem um, is given, and Senker offers a remedy to the emotional bankruptcy of the city and calls for political redress for the black underclass. And he says New York must listen to the tom tom's rhythm and blood, to God's trombones, to Harlem. Now, you know that Harlem is a neighborhood in the New York City borough of Manhattan. So Harlem is a neighborhood in the New York City borough of Manhattan. Borough means a small part of a small city or small place. Now, since the 1920s, it has been a major African American residential, cultural, and business center. So, here the term Harlem refers to the unification of African American life, and he also talks about uh, the cone spring from the pavement. There is a usage in the second stanza about second section, the cone springing from the pavements, and that represents the marriage of Africa and America, of nature and sophistication. And it also stands for the assimilation of the white rum and black milk. The masks decorated are fabulous masks, as one cannot distinguish the African from the American. So he is trying to um, unify African and American life. And then he talks about listen to the far beating of your nocturnal heart rhythm and blood of the drum and blood and drum. Now, this drum stands for the spiritual rhythm of African traditional life, as echoed in Gabriel O'Cara's Mystic Drum, which we'll discuss in the coming part. And the interchange of the words drum and blood reflect a pulse like rhythm that highlights the same. So, in section 3, of New York, he admonishes the city to let black blood flow into its blood. So Senger thus suggests that especially black music carries the culture that can cure the city. So he feels that blacks can do wonders and they can do a lot. And he claims that unity is to be discovered in the reconciliation of the lion, the bull, and the tree, the wild, the domestic, and the vegetative world. And eventually, he comes to understand there is no significant meaning to this sort of life, and the end becomes the means. So, the meaning of the journey no longer holds significance in a fast forward life. So he says that there is no need to invent the mermaids. America is always questioned regarding a history of its own, its roots and tradition. And declares that there is no need to indulge in a culture of myth that they do not possess in the first place. And he says that life has lost its true purpose and tarnished in the steel articulations. And the steel articulations again refer to the industrial revolution. And it may also allude to the steel nerve of the colonizer. And this also connotes their rigid stance and policies. And the poet wants the black blood to act as a lubricant and life force in such a situation. And he says blood is red in color and therefore universal. And here the poet considers this blood exceptional by attributing it with adjective black. But again, it acts as the oil of life or sustains life that is a universal phenomenon. So this is how he ends the poem. And as you see, the major themes discussed in the poem are artificiality, cultural heritage, life without interest, and so on. And when you read this poem, it reminds you of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, the poem which talks about how blacks and whites can unite and they live in harmony. All those things, all those dreams are being explained. Similar, such a situation is also again reflected when you read To New York. So, this poem is also very important. And the title To New York. Now, beauty of New York is explained through the terms blue eye and golden girl. And he exclaims, that is, Sengar exclaims that at first the beauty of New York held him in wonder, as it was superficial and artificial, and then it was limited to physicality. And he also says that later he understood the lifelessness of New York, and he says that um, the he also says that we have to fight hard in order to bring unity between Africans and Americans. And he says that even when you closely observe, Americans themselves do not have a heritage at all. Therefore, there is no need to invent the mermaids. And he says that negritude into a people who are probably very closed up, and rallies his Negro brothers to take pride in their heritage, because Negroes or the Africans or the blacks have a proper knowledge about their heritage or their culture or their tradition, but Americans do not have so. So he says that do not have equal position, so it's okay. Let's black blood flow on New York, which means let the blacks also, their blood also flow on New York. So, in short, like we discussed earlier, the major themes discussed in the poem are artificiality, cultural heritage, life without interest, and so on. So, with that, we come to the end of the poem To New York. Next poem is The Mystic Drum by Gabriel O'Kara. Now, Gabriel O'Kara lived from 1921 to 2019. He was an African poet. He focused the ice cold attitude of Europeans to the African culture and their representation rather in a humiliated way. So he often focused on the ice cold attitude or the negative attitude of the Europeans to the African culture and their representation. And he was born in Bomondi in Bayelsa State in Nigeria in 1921. Like we said earlier, he is a Nigerian poet and novelist and has infused his poetry with images of his Nigerian Delta birthplace. And his writings links the concept of his native language, Iowa, Ayaw, with the English vocabulary. Okay, IJAW, that's the spelling, and IR with the English vocabulary. So that's the native language used by Gabriel O'Kara. And he was awarded Commonwealth Poetry Award in 1979. His famous poems are Piano and Drums, You Laughed and Laughed and Laughed, Once Upon a Time, etc. During his life, O'Kara did odd jobs such as a bookbinder, journalist, radio broadcaster, and newspaper editor. So he worked in different positions. And he has also traveled to the USA where he helped raise money for Nigeria, giving poetry recitals. So through poetry recitals, he um, traveled to the US and he helped raise money for Nigeria. Okera's poems tend to reflect the problems that African nations face as they are torn between the culture of their European colonialists and their traditional African heritage. So he often um portrayed the problems that African nations face because they are torn between the culture of the European colonialists and their traditional African heritage. And he also looks at the traumatic effects that colonization and decolonization can have on the self and on one's sense of personal identity. So this is all about Gabriel O'Cara. Now let's see the poem, The Mystic Drum. Now the poem Mystic Drum is an African poem, both in content and form. It has three different parts. Okay, an initial phase of conventional knowledge when men are men and fishes are fish. This is what lines 1 to 15 talks. Now, you know that being an African, Okera goes back to his roots in history, religion, and culture, and also folklore. And through its image and symbols, rhythm, and tone, the poem expresses the subtle nuances of an African experience. So, very minute details are being used to give the nuances of an African experience. So, in a way, we can say that this poem justifies the modern dictum a poet should not mean but be. That is, a poet should be uh, what it has to talk. And you know that in African folklore, the beating of drums has ritualistic and mystical significance. And it said that the beating of the drum unites the mind and heart of the drum beater with the outer world of nature. That is, the beating of the drum unites mind and heart of the drum beater with the outer world of nature. Now, uh, but the idea of cosmic unity in the poem does not last long because there is an end to this beating of the drum. And the poem's thematic emphasis is not upon how man and nature became one when the mystic drum beats within him, but it's about the brevity of their experience. Okay? And the return to the reality makes the poet sing, never to beat so loud anymore. Okay? Now, and also um, a middle phase, like I said, there are three different parts: an initial phase of conventional knowledge when are men and fishes are fish, and a middle phase of more intimate knowledge when men are no longer fishes, and a final phase of substantial knowledge when men are once again men and fishes are once again fishes, with the difference that at this phase, the beloved lady of the lyric is depicted as standing behind the trace with her lips parted in her smile. Now, this is more particularly a philosophical poem in which the dynamic directions and management of the mystic drum of passion that beats in the poet's inside are dramatically reenacted. Now, when you're talking about this poem, what you find is that there is the dialectic between tradition and influences, and you cannot find any noticeable reference to the neo-colonialism or cultural imperialism. And he does not relate the problems of culture to the economic sphere. And now, when we are talking about the mystic drum, it's essential to tell that it's a love poem. Now, this is a love lyric, and there is a lady referred to in the poem, and it may stand as a symbol that represents the lure of Western life and how it appeared to be interesting at first but later becomes unpleasant to the poem. And the drum, like you see in African poetry, generally stands for spiritual pulse of traditional African life. And the poet asserts that first, as the drum beats inside him, fishes dances in the river, and men and women dances on the land to the rhythm of the drum. But standing behind the tree, there stood an outsider who smiled with an air of indifference at the richness of their culture. Now the drum still continued to beat, rippling the air with quickened tempo, compelling the dead to dance and sing with their shadows. Now, this shows the ancestral glory which overpowers other consideration. Now, so powerful is the mystic drum that it brings back even the dead alive. Now, the rhythm of the drum is the aching for an ideal Nigerian state of harmony. So, this poem is written so beautifully that it gives you a glimpse of African culture as such. Now, we can see that the poem demonstrates a many sided ritual pattern of imitation from innocence through intimacy to experience. First, they are innocent, then an intimacy is developed through to an experience. And on the whole, when you go through the poem, what you find is that the African culture is connected with nature. The mystic drum invokes the sun, the moon, the river, gods, and trees began to dance. Now, there is a lady mentioned in the poem and is an outsider and the colonizer as well, and their culture is destroyed. That is, African culture is destroyed by the Westerners who started ruling over Africa, and that could be understood very clearly from the lady who is the personification of industrialization. And to end with, in the poem, when the drum is beaten, men becomes fishes and fishes become men. But when mystic drum stopped beating, men becomes men and fishes become fish. And it shows that life becomes dry and mechanical. Okay, so from this, what you should understand is that mystic drum and the transformation are projected to the personality of the beloved who acquires extraordinary powers that effectively transforms her into a supernatural being, indeed a goddess invested with the powers of the things of the ground, that is earth, of the eyes of the sky, the sun and the moon, that is heaven, and of the river gods, that is water. So this is how mystic drum is written. It's a very beautiful form which is connected to nature, tradition, and African culture. And this is Okera's love lyric, and it has he has portrayed the um, problems or the humiliating um, experiences Africans have in the hands of the Westerners who are colonized them, who are overpowering them in every way possible. So, this poem is a wonderful poem and it gives a great insight of the African culture, which is closely associated with nature, especially the role of drum in their culture is important. Now let's see the poem Africa. Now Africa is a poem written by David Diop, who lived from 1927 to 1960. He was born again to a Senegalese father and a Cameroonian mother in the city of Bordeaux, France in 1927. And it said that he started writing poetry while he was still at school, that is, at a very young age. And he was one of the contributors to Leopold Senger's anthology of poems published in French. And this was a major milestone in the history of Black French literature as it put forth the movement of negritude. So, like Leopold Senger, David Diop also has a prominent role in the negritude movement. And Diop's poetry talks about the glorious past of Africa. It said that Diop died at a very early age of 33 in an air crash off Dakar, Senegal in 1960. And his poetry will always be remembered as one of the milestones in the reservoir of African literature. So David Icke was also an important writers of the African literature. Now let's see the poem Africa. Now the poem Africa begins with Diop's recollection about Africa as a land he has not seen but only heard about from his grandmother's song. His choice of words like distant symbolizes how far he is from his country, a feeling based on his real life, as he lived in France throughout his childhood and only visited Africa in the 1950s. So his his poem is full of memories of his native land, that is Africa, which he has not seen but only heard about from his grandmother's songs. And it said that he lived in France throughout his childhood and only visited Africa in the 1950s. Now, despite all these, he paints a vivid scene of Africa and the proud warriors who walk on its ancestral savanna. So, though he has not visited Africa, he paints a vivid, a clear picture of Africa and the proud warriors. You can sense how much he missed his homeland by his stress on the word Africa, and he continues to call it my Africa. To stress it is his land and his feelings of patriotism towards it. So when he says my Africa, it shows his intimacy or his closeness or his patriotism, okay, towards his Africa. And he also continues to say that he has never known Africa, but despite the distance, he cannot disagree with how much it is a part of him. And in the second stanza, what you find is that he is angry. The next stanzas are angry and accusatory. He talks in an accusatory way, as he stresses that it is the blood and sweat of his people which is irrigating the fields for the benefit of other people. So he says that his people had struggled a lot. By this, what he is pointing a finger at the colonialists who exploited black people and used them as slaves to extract profits from their hard labor. So he is criticizing the colonialists. And again, in the coming stanzas, he urges the black people to stand up to the pain and the humiliation that they are suffering in their own land, just to stand up and fight against the colonialists and to fight for their freedom or their right. And he also reminds them of the strength and pride they have in them, and to say no to the whip of the colonialists, which makes them work under the hot midday sun and leave scars on their backs. So he's giving them strength, and he is reminding them of their power and their pride they should have in them, and to fight against all the cruelties of the colonialists who make them work hard under worst conditions. Okay, so he is urging them to fight for their rights. And David Diop's this poem, Africa, celebrates the typical love of the African for their motherland and ancestors. Now, the Africa the poet speaks of deals with proud warriors in ancestral savanna, the Africa of whom his grandmother's song sings. And it's not only with the present but also with the past this poem deals with. And thus, the love is not something infected, but it's transmitted in the blood and can never be evaporated till death. So, that is the strong point which he gives. That is, the love which they have is not infected, but it's transmitted in the blood through generation to generation, and it can never be evaporated till their death. And the greatest irony is that though he has never seen his ancestors, their blood flows in his veins, and thereby he can feel their love for his country and their adoration of the tradition. So he says that though he has not seen his ancestors, he feels that, or he says that, or he establishes that their blood flows in his vein, and so he can feel their love for their country, their patriotism, and their adoration of the tradition, and that spirit is inside him. So it is their black blood that irrigates the field. So he says that it's their black blood that irrigates the field. And This is a poem in which Diop, by the power of his imagination, calls forth three stages in the continent of Africa's history. One is pre-colonial days of proud warrior tribes, then the colonial experiences of subjugation and humiliation, and the post-colonial freedom and sovereignty. So, step by step, he says the power of his imagination. He talks about the three stages. One is pre-colonial days, about the pre-colonial days, then colonial days, and then post-colonial days. The first seven line presents an essentially idealized image of Africa with which the speaker identifies, and then follows a realistic picture of Africa's experience of bitterness, despair, and mockery under colonial rule. And then the last eight lines present a future of hope built on some of the realistic elements of colonial experience. That is, Africa as a young tree patiently springing up and gradually acquiring the bitter taste of liberty. So, in short, we can say that in Diop's poem Africa, the poet hopes to create a renewed Africa out of the bitter experiences of colonialism. So, he ends it in a positive note, and his preoccupation with the past glories is also suggestive of its post colonial nature. So, in every way, this poem is post colonial because it gives an understanding of the effects of colonialism, uh, which have affected African people. Okay, so that's all about the poem Africa. Next poem is House and Land, written by Alan Carnot. Alan Carnot lived from 1911 to 2001. He was born in Timaru 1911 in 1911, and his father was a fourth generation New Zealander and his mother was English born. And his father was an Anglican clergyman, and he lived in a variety of Anglican rectories around the far south of the South Island. And Carnot studied at both Canterbury and Auckland universities and worked for various newspapers during this period. Now, in between, he prepared for the Anglican ministry, however, and decided not to be ordained in the early 1930s. And his religious upbringing and personal religious crisis were an important influence in his writings, and later he returned to the South Island in 1934 and went back to working for newspapers. And during this time, he became good friends with Dennis Glover. And during the war years, his writings became influenced by history and the idea of national identity. And that can be seen that after the war, he moved to more personal and universal themes. And finally, he died in 2001 at the age of 90. So, this is a very short biography of Alan Carnot. Now, let's get into the poem. Now, this poem is also interesting, like the other poems we discussed so far. And this poem reveals three main characters. When you read the poem, you will come across three main characters. One is a historian, then there is a cowman, and a Mrs. Old Wilson. Now, apart from them, the poem also brings forth another character, an old dog as well. So, altogether, you can see three main characters and a dog. That is four characters. That is a historian, a cowman, and Mrs. Old Wilson, and an old dog. Now, the stanza one depicts that a historian is visiting the farm, presumably because it is an old farm from the colonial period, and he speaks to the cowman who says he has worked for Miss Wilson since her husband died. And in the second stanza, it describes a dog that lives on the farm, and the dog is chained up and spends its day moping between the toilet and fowl house, that is chicken coop, and he is also trapped there, going back and forth between these two worlds. Okay, and the third stanza portrays Miss Wilson in her home. The pictures that surround her represents the British heritage, the world her family has come from. And in the fourth stanza, Miss Wilson comments on how the people in the colonies, that is Maori, do not understand the concept of land ownership. Now, because she implies that they are less intelligent with her words. So she says that they are less intelligent, and it also shows how much land the settlers received on their arrival, a land that was often simply taken. So that idea is being revealed in the fourth stanza. And in the fifth stanza, again the fifth stanza returns to the milk shed, and we can see the historian is still talking to the cowman, and he says he is leaving next winter as it is too quiet, which means not much of a life for him. And in the sixth stanza, what happens is the historian analyzes the evidence of the place, and his conclusion is that the people, that is the settlers, still long for the home they have left. And the seventh stanza shows that the cowman and the rabbiter, that is the only one who is at home, are done with their day works and are going off for a drink, and is going off for a drink. And the last line, I quote, with never a soul at home, unquote, emphasize the sense of displacement they experience. So this is a very important poem, and the symbolism of the confined dog is reinforced as it now looks lost and lame, again a fair description of the old woman. Now, uh, in short, we can see sentiments of alienation and cultural transformation, even in their language. Philosophy of life is displayed, their indigenous culture is polluted with cultural imperialism. The tone of the poem is also rather depressing. So, from this poem, it's very clear that Miss Wilson is hopelessly obsessed with her past, and the future appears to hold up, uh, that is, hold no hope at all. And the cowherd also says that he is leaving the house due to the prevailing silent atmosphere, and the house lacks happiness and merriment. And it is this house is haunted by utter hopelessness, and it is symbolized by the dog brooding in contemplation, and the stagnation is also visible as it is caught between the two worlds. The cowman also leaves for the hill with the rabbiter, and though it rains, it does not bring happiness. The dog retires to its barrel where it remains lost and lame. Now, lame and lost are two postcolonial words. The lame suggests handicap of the settlers as they missed their homeland, and the settler always felt themselves to be incomplete, though settlers never settled down. So that is the crux of this poem, the house and land. Okay, with that we come to the end of this poem, the house and land. Next is a poem, Australia. A.D. Hope. Australia is a poem written by A.D. Hope. Alec Derwent Hope is a well-known poet, essayist, and critic. He is the best known Australian poet of great repute internationally. His first collection of verse was The Wandering Islands, which was published in 1955. Other major collections include Poems, which was published in 1960, A.D. Hope, 1963, A Late Picking, 1975, A Book of Answers in 1978, The Drifting Continent in 1979, Antichenos in 1981, The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus in 1982, The Age of Reason in 1985, Orpheus in 1991. And Ladies from the Sea, which was published in 1987, is a play by Hope. Chance Encounters, which was published in 1992, is a collection of reminiscence. The Cave and the Spring, uh, published in 1965. The New Cratylus, which was published in 1979, a collection of essays written by him. Now let's get into the poem. Australia by Eddie Hope is a sarcastic and captivating poetry. In Australia, Hope gives his picture of what constitutes Australia and who is an Australian. Now, this poem describes almost everything about Australia, the physical features of the wilder parts, the cities, and the people and the civilization. Trees and trees, dull green, lifeless grey, all resembling the uniform of soldiers of a modern army. And that covers the hill of Australia. Now, those hills stretching endlessly are like the stretched out pose of a demolished Egyptian sphinx. You know that sphinx is a famous statue of a creature, part woman, part lion, and part eagle, or like a stone lion eroded by the passing of time. Now, it's not right to describe her as a young country, newly occupied. She looks the emptiest of lands, and land used and discarded, one incapable of undergoing any growth or development. You cannot find any growth or development. So it's not right to describe Australia as a young country, newly occupied. Australia has no history or tradition of music, architecture, of history itself. She does not have the emotions and superstitions of young lands, all intended upon development. Now, Australia's rivers flow into inland, sands, and stagnate. Correspondingly, rivers of stupidity flow into her cities where dull citizens live. In those cities live the ultimate, last generations, and these people, at odds with their environment, boast not that they live, but that they survive. They are typical of a race of people who live in a perishing, dying earth. Now, she talks, this place, that is Australia, uh, have five cities. They are of Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, Canberra, Adelaide, and are like running sores with which eat away the vitals of Australia. They form a kind of robber state people by second generation European immigrants who emerge timidly and live a superficial kind of life in the foreign country, that is Australia. Now, yet there are some people like the poet who are no longer interested in the rich complexities of modern thoughts of the advanced countries of the West. Now they turn instead to the Arabian Light Desert or paucity of thought of Australia, hoping that even from that desert there would emerge some wise man or prophet. Perhaps some new thoughts or inquiry might spring up in his backward country, something that has escaped the thinking of the cultured apes of modern civilization with their abstruse learned doubts. Now, the poet finds many things about Australia that are unproposing, but still he is relieved to find on the mental plane that the country is free of the neurosis and often degenerate surrealism and obscurity of modern Western civilization. Perhaps from such a country where one is all too aware of the physical presence of nature, there may emerge a desert prophet who provides a simple philosophy of clean and clear living and thinking. The poet speaks sardonically of modern civilization. So, this is a very short summary of this poem, Australia. Now, when you read the poem, what you understand is that it contains the value of Australian culture and society, and hence it is considered as one of the precious works in Australian literature. And the value of Australia that is described in this poem is that of geographical condition, history, and its government. Now, like I mentioned just now, the first stanza of the poem discusses the geographical condition of Australia, which consists of forests filled with trees. And then the poet compares the Australian desert to the Arabian desert, as they were wide and covered 80% of the country's landmass. And then in the third stanza, the poet explains about many rivers in Australia, and it flows unpredictably and are high in mineral deposits. So it can be seen that these contrasting geographical features have affected the Australian society. Now, the people in Australia are used to living in warm weather, and they pray for snowfall just like the Africans and the Asians do. Now, when we take a look at the history of Australia, it can be found that colonization by the British created negative impact on the Australian native people. So far we went through so many poems, and in most of the poems we find the negative impact of colonization. We live, but we survive. These two lines, I mean terms, explain their condition. And in the fifth stanza, Hope wrote that Europeans were robbers who exploited Australia's natural resources. And the arrival of large number of immigrants to Australia from countries like China, Afghanistan, Japan, etc., caused native people of Australia to face gross cultural differences and crisis. Now, lastly, the word her in the poem refers to the head of the country, Queen Elizabeth II, during British rule in Australia. Now, the poem is also structured in such a way that each stanza consists of 4 lines with rhyme scheme as A, B, B, A. And the poet also uses imagery as a tool to convey the meaning of the poem. Metaphor is used in the poem to depict a reality that Australia have human qualities, and the tone of the poem is sarcastic. Now, in short, we can say that at the end of the poem, the poet anticipates the coming of the prophet out of lush jungle of modern thoughts to cure the cultured apes of their intellectual bareness. So, in short, we can say that this poem criticizes the attitudes, ethics, and lifestyle in description of the empty land, which lacks cultural identity. Okay, with that, let's wind up this poem, Australia. Next is the poem Aboriginal Australia. It's written by Jack Davis, and he lived from 1917 to 2000. Jack Davis is another noted name in the field of Australian Aboriginal poetry. He is a poet, short story writer, playwright, and activist for the Aboriginal people. Now, he was born in Perth in 1917. He was the fourth of 11 children to Aboriginal parents who originally came from the northwest of Australia. And on his mother's side, there was a descent from the 19th century Afghan community. Now, when Davis was less than a year old, he traveled to the southwest of Western Australia with his family, where his father was appointed foreman of a timber mill at Yarloo. And the first Born and Other Poems, which was published in 1970, was his first book of poetry, and his other important volumes of verse include Jagardu, Poems from Aboriginal Australia, which was published in 1978, John Pat and Other Poems in 1978, and Black Life in 1992. He has also written an autobiography of his childhood, A Boy's Life, which was published in 1991, and he was also an editor of Paperback, a collection of Black Australian writings, which was published in 1990. David was a quicksilver personality. He was subjected to the pressure of poverty. He worked as a windmill man, a timber worker, a horse breaker, a dover, and also a head stockman. So he worked in various positions for his living, and his poetry is not elitist. So he wrote for uh, everyone to read. Now let's get into the poem Aboriginal Australia. Now, in the Aboriginal Australian poetry, there are 5 major themes usually discussed: stolen generation, assimilation, deprivation of land, incarceration and reconciliation, etc. Okay, and loss of land is also a recurrent theme in Australian Aboriginal poetry. Now, let's see what is this Aboriginal Australia poem is all about. Now, this poem focuses on the European influences upon Aboriginal life, as well as the oppression and death that the European population brought with them. Davis uses an openly depressed tone to display the hardship that his ancestors faced dealing with the arrival of the European settlers. Now, this somber tone allows of true emotion to be portrayed through this piece of writing. And Davis' key idea links well to the overall theme as it displays a race inability to comprehend the culture of another, resulting in violence and a sense of mutual disrespect that has lasted for over 200 years. Now, Davis uses multiple historical references, which will be extremely obscure to all but the most knowledgeable historians. So, only the most knowledgeable historians can understand the multiple historical references used by Davis. For others, it will remain obscure. And he also mentions the Yirrakale people, creator of the Bark Petition of Aboriginal Land Rights, the Lake George Hills incident, a battle with the Aboriginal people over a freshwater lake, McLarty's Run, a reference that pleads the audience to find out more about the bloody foundation that modern Australia is built upon rather than have it forgotten. So all these things are being discussed, and Davis' poetry reveals deep attachment to the ancestral land, and his love for the land is presented in an extensive depiction of images and scenes of Aboriginal landscape. His poetry is peopled with samples of Aboriginal characters through which he exhibits the devastating impact of the British invasion on Aboriginal people, culture, and land. So, in short, we can say that Davis' poetry is revealing a deep attachment to ancestral land. Okay, with that, we come to the end of the poem Aboriginal Australia. Now, let's see the poem Journey to the Interior, written by Margaret Atwood. She is a living poet. She was born in 1939. Now, Margaret Eleanor Atwood is a prolific Canadian poet, novelist, literary critic, essayist, and environmental activist. She has been shortlisted for Booker Prize 5 times and won it once in 2000 for her novel The Blind Assassin. Now, many of her poems have been inspired by myth and fairy tales, which have been interests of hers from an early age. Now, being a novelist, she has written very famous novels such as The Edible Woman, which was published in 69, sorry, and Surfacing, which was published in 1972. And then you have The Handmaid's Tale, which is a very famous novel written by her in 1985, and The Blind Assassin in 2000, The Year of the Flood in 2009, and many more. Okay, so, and her poetry collection is The Circle Game, which was published in 1964, Expeditions in 1965, Speeches for Dr. Frankenstein in 1966, Power Politics in 1971, Love Songs of a Terminator in 1983, Snake Palms in 1983, You Bidding in 1978, and The Door in 2007. Now, this is a very short overview of her biography. Now, let's see the poem Journey into the Interior. Now, this is a monologue. This is the apt poetic form for introspection. It is a metaphysical form with the recurring motive of journey, which Atwood uses and explores in other works like Surfacing, written by her. And the interior used in the poem referred to the psyche of the poetess, The poetess utilizes an extended metaphor here. Her inner exploration stretches out to the journeying of the mountain. So here she is indirectly talking about the inner mind, or the psyche of the poet. The inner life is complex, and if delved into deeply, it can be confronting, demoralizing, and depressing, leading to madness, even self harm. So she says that inner life is very complex, and when you delve deep into it, it's very difficult, or very complex. Like it can be confronting, demoralizing, depressing, and maybe it can even lead to madness or even self inflicting. Now, life can be absurd, meaningless, directionless, even futile. So she says sensory perceptions and rational thoughts processes are not always reliable to gain true self insight, rather than a holistic, emotional, and lateral thinking are needed. So she says that life can be absurd, meaningless, directionless, even futile, and you cannot rely completely on the sensory perceptions and rational thoughts, because sometimes it will not help to gain true self insight. Language can be inadequate or an obstacle to express the depth of our feeling, and it's always said that when you think something or when you have a concept, it is fresh in your mind. So when you transfer it into words, either as a story or as a poem, uh, the depth of your feeling is lost. So um, what you intend may not come out completely when you transform it into a poetry or story or whatever it is. So that kind of emotion is what she is talking about in this poem. And towards the end, what you understand is that Journey to the Interior is a subtle, multi-layered poem with nuances that may be contrary and therefore wide open to multiple interpretation. And she says the dreamlike mood is created by meditative thinking. Meditative means thinking deeply about something, especially when you're sad or worried. Reflective musing, a period of thinking carefully about something or telling people your thoughts. The tone is also morbid or melancholic, and this poem is written in a postmodern style. Okay, and um, with multiple allusions, dissimilar images, and it communicates in latter thinking rather than logical sequential processes. So this poem itself is an allegory, and it is a narrative which is serving as an extended metaphor. So you find an extended metaphor in this poem, and so it talks about the inner life, which is complex, which is confronting, demoralizing, and depressing, and it may lead to madness or even self harm. Okay, so this is what she is trying to explain through this poem. Now, this poem is very important in every sense. Okay, so she is talking about mind through the images of landscape, etc. Now let's get into the poem Ruins of a Great House. Now Derek Walcott from 1930, he was born in 1930. In the words of William Walsh, he is the finest, the most complete of West Indian poets. Now, Walcott had a thorough grounding in European history and art and literature. He was a painter before he was a poet. He often quotes or echoes lines from the English metaphysical writers like Eliot, Dylan Thomas, and others. He by no means ignores the well known dilemmas of the West Indian situation. Walcott's poetical works include 25 poems, which was published in 1948, Epitaph for the Young, which was published in 1949, In a Green Night Poems 1948 to 1960 was published in 1962. Selected Poems which was published in 1965. The Gulf and the Other Poems which was published in 1969. Another Life in 1973 and Sea Grapes in 1976. Now, Walcott's main concerns are with isolation, estrangement from society, hunger for human contact, separation from other persons, from other races, from history, from God as in the castaway, with the poet's vocation and craft as in the castaway and the girl, with the relationship between the black people and the white people, the colonizer and the colonized, as in the ruins of a great house. Now, let's see Ruins of a Great House, which was written by Derek Walcott. Now, most of Derek's poems have the theme of different race, rulers, and civilization. His style of writing is reflected in this poem because it revolves around the corrupted or decayed society. Now, the title of the poem, Ruins of a Great House, also suggests something is destroyed or decayed, and he might be referring to the remains of the plantation house. So, this poem makes a nostalgic journey into the earlier history of a dilapidated plantation house. Now, Derek Walcott's Ruins of a Great House is a poem written in his perspective of the Caribbean in the 19th century. He uses graphic imagery, irregular language, and rhyme schemes to convey what he feels were serious problems in the Caribbean during this period. Now, throughout the poem, Walcott uses a unique language, tone, and rhythm to convey his message in such a way that many footnotes were provided for this poems. Walcott uses many words that refer to decaying or dead things like moth, like leprosy, exiled craftsman, dead ash, and the layout of the poem also seems rather dark and disturbing. And he uses a plethora of uh, images and references to the rotting of the slave house in the Caribbean and the British Empire. And it is also evident that Walcott has feelings of fury and resentment towards the history of slavery in the Caribbean in the 1800s. Now, the poet also explores the inevitable tension arising between master and the slave, perpetrator and victim, history and legacy, writer and conscience. Now, the two dominant themes in Derek Walcott's poem, Ruins of a Great House, are death and decay. It is also important to note that the poem ends with an allusion to John Donne's poem, No Man is an Island, which argues all of mankind's sorrow are connected due to mankind's unity. So man's sorrow is connected due to mankind's unity. Hence, all in all, the poem seems to be arguing that despite the fact that slaves and slaveholders have existed, all mankind is connected in death. So death is the leveler of every human being. And hence, some of the themes in the poem include death, decay, slavery, and unity of man. Now, with that, this poem uh, ends. So, we can say that Ruins of a Great House focuses on history, colonialism, literature, and corruption through power, and the poem reflects the period when British colonized great extent of the Caribbean during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, surroundings the land surrounding the lands with plantation where the black slaves were made to work, and they were subjected to abominable cruelties. And through this poem, Walcott reveals ambivalence towards the culture of Great Britain at its most dominant in the 18th and 19th century, when slavery was a hugely profitable business. And then this poem also suggests how Spanish or African people were murdered. And towards the end, he says that um, some of the important points to be noted is that This poem talks about death, decay, slavery, and unity of man, and that is the main idea of this poem, Ruins of a Great House. And when you closely observe this poem, what you find is that the first lines of this poem are without any capitalization, okay, and the next comes as an evocation of the ruins, okay. So this is all about this poem. And the last line, the expression from evil days, from evil times, suggests durational difference, that is no difference to the consequences. So that is the meaning of from evil days, from evil times. That is, there is no difference to the consequences. Okay, now when you look at the structure of this poem, it is thematically complex. Colonial and post-colonial impulses alternate in a sort of jigsaw puzzle. Emotion after emotion alternate in kaleidoscope variety, and the poet swings from one emotion to another, and the poet is caught in an emotional whirlpool that objectifies his sense of rootlessness and search for identity. So that is all about this poem, Ruins of a Great House. Next is an important poem, that is Arrival, and this poem is written by E. Tian Hong. He lived from 1933 to 1990. He is a Malayan poet of Chinese ancestry, and he was born at Malacca during the British colonial period. He was one of the first generation Malaya poets writing in English, and his first book of poetry appeared in 1960. He was extremely disturbed, troubled, and disillusioned by political development in the newly independent Malaysia. Later, he emigrated to Australia with his family and settled down in Perth in 1975. He officially became an Australian citizen in the year 1979. He died of cancer on 27th April 1990 in Perth, Western Australia. And as a poet, his works concentrate on discrimination, dislocation, exile, identity, and idea of home, signifying his own personal journey and condition. And his works remain highly influential in the literary landscape of post-colonial, independent Malaysia. Malayan traditional literature reached the public in the form of stage plays and shadow plays, and contemporary Malayan literature is identified with the author and is presented in the written form. Now, let's see the poem Arrival. Now, you know that altogether this person, that is E. Tian Ho, published three poetry collections. They are Eye of the Many Faces, which was published in 1960, Myths of the Wilderness in 1976, Tranquera in 1985. And these three works represent the poet's three significant periods of social and political experiences. Now, the poem Arrival is included in the collection Myths for the Wilderness, which was published in 1976 and which was written after Malaysia's independence and before the poet's migration to Australia. Now, during this period, he had witnessed many social and political changes in the new nation, including the infamous rights of the April 1969. And themes are more heterogeneous in the collection and deals with collective political and social criticism. Now, of the 61 poems in Myths of the Wilderness, about half of them are social and political poems. Now, each poetry collection was written from unique time and space, and it means that poets' literary output are in radically changing social and political context. Now, the poem Arrival describes the modernization of the capital city, as a form of historical change from a natural landscape to a cityscape. So, natural landscape to cityscape, that is the shift taking place. Then, the poet's personal comments on modernization are expressed in the poem, and the poem is constructed upon the arrival at the destination of a journey, which symbolizes the end of modernization process through the destruction of nature. Okay, so nature is completely destroyed um, because of modernization process. Now the poem displays a set of ironic interrogations against the beautiful city through the destruction of nature. So he questions the destruction of nature for for the beautification of the city. And the poem represents that this is nothing but a wasteland for the poet and demonstrates the hollowness of the poet. The poet also makes an evaluation completely different from that made by the public. And people doubt about their arrival and is unable to find a solution to the problem they are facing. And he also laments on the loss of nature due to the consequence of the wrong policies and shallow ideas. Now, one can find autobiographical elements and complete Malaya development in the poem, and equal rights are also promised in this poem. So, in a way, Arrival is a very interesting poem which talks about Malaya independence and the modernization of the capital city, etc. So that's all about the poem Arrival. Now let's see the next poem. So what if I live in a house made by idiots? It's written by Almgir Hashmi, uh, who lived from 1951 till date. Okay. Now, Aurangzeb Alamgir Hashmi is an English poet. He's of Pakistani origin. He is better known as an English poet, but he is a professor of English and comparative literature, an editor of literary and scholarly journals, a scholar critic, a broadcaster, a translator, musician, and a weekend canoeist. Now, he acknowledges life as a gift. He won a poetry prize in the All Pakistan Creative Writing Contest in 1972 and the Patras Bokhari Award National Literature Prize for the Pakistan Academy of Letters in 1985 and was the first English language writer to bring such recognition to English writing in Pakistan. And he also widely published abroad, especially in the United Kingdom. So he is famous in the United Kingdom, Australia, India, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. He was a judge of the Commonwealth Writers Prize 1990 and a member of the 1996 jury for the Neustadt International Prize for Literature. Now, he is a hybridizer of cultures on one level, and on the other level, he is both participant and observer. And his poetic persona is complex and multifaceted. It can be ironic and deeply sincere. It can be Pakistani and American, it can be spiritual and material. So, that is why you feel a kind of complexity and multifaceted nature in his work. And love in Hashmi's poem is never a series of emotional responses removed from cultural implications. Okay, and Hashmi is honestly a transcultural poet with varied interests and diverse people. I mean, diverse perceptions. More than a traveler, he is a world citizen who is living in a place as diverse as Switzerland, the USA, and Pakistan. Hashmi writes poems full of shifts between places, slippages, the negotiation of geographical and cultural specialities that one finds so attractive as a multi nation reader. So he gives importance for cultural space, negotiation of geographical space, then slippages, etc. Now let's get into the poem. So, what if I live in a house made by idiots? Now, this is a representation of the choked cry of marginalized citizens who are destined to live under unsafe roof where horror dangles like the sword of Damocles. Now, the title of the poem itself is very interesting because it's a question. Okay, it is asked as a question. Now, the poem describes the situation that necessitated the poet to live in a house made by idiots. Now, the house was, the poem is an explanation of the title of the poem. He tells that the house where he lived were made by idiots, the house were dirty, and they did not provide shelter to the inmates. Now, the warmth, cozy feelings, comfort, security that one needed were distant dreams in such houses. Now, the poem deals with one of the horrors found the common lot, where houses remain mere house and they lack what a home has. Now, what the poet tries to picturize is the life in slums either in India or Pakistan. Now, the poem is relevant and time. Uh, the poem denotes is nothing but the recent time. Now, this poem is relevant even today, and the time the poem denotes is nothing but the present time. The poet also satirizes the pathetic condition of the houses of marginalized people. Humor is also a vehicle of expression employed in the poem. The poet questions the prejudiced mindset of common folk who shoot secret arrows at about their humble dwellings. And the poet also employs a few images which evoke the feelings of marginal, such as holes of the wall filled with toothpaste, a house with wet walls and sloth every 3 months, the floor are cleaned for the monsoon might blow off the roof, municipal water gives further lease, and insects introduce you a part of your body minute by minute are suitable and exact images for the context. Now, then he talks about the first house where he stayed was too narrow and has bomb shelters where people lived with much care, so planned that made the inmate ready at any time. Even the tiny holes on the wall were filled with toothpaste, like we mentioned now, which made the room so airtight and even the breathing became a task. And another house where the boy now lives has wet walls, and the room became slow every 3 months. Now, the poet says that it's because of the tears of the inmates or the tears of the sky. Now, the floor of the house is always neat and tidy because monsoon blows off the room every year. The grasses in the lawn kept debating and weeds blossom in them. Now, to make the condition worse, municipal water pipes leak as a result, water puddles here and there, which causes for mosquito multiply. These mosquitoes prick on the body of inmate every now and then, only to make them aware of their different body parts. Now, the poet employs a few these images to explain all these things in a very suitable and exact images apt for the context. Now, this poem is written in blank verse and it follows no rhyme scheme. The poem evokes the feeling of the marginalized about their humble dwelling, and this poem also talks about the political situation and how the political leaders treat people at the time of election and after the election, what is the condition of the people. So maybe this could be another interpretation that this house uh, is our country. It could be India or Pakistan, and the idiots could be the politicians who uh, came into power after election, and how they treat common folk and what were their promises and how they are dealing after the election or after they came up to the throne. All such things could be all interpreted with this title. So what if I live in a house made by idiots? So idiots could be a reference to the politicians. So with that, we come to the end of this poem. What if I live in a house made by idiots? Now next is the poem Negus. Now this poem is written by Edward Kanwa Brathwaite. Um, he lived from 1930 to 2020. Kamwa Brathwaite is a Caribbean poet, scholar, historian, a performer, an archivist, and an activist. His original name is Lawson Edward Brathwaite, and he is also known for his studies of Black cultural life in both in Africa and throughout the African diasporas of the world. Now, Barbados is the island where Brathwaite was born in 1930, and it is the most easterly of the Caribbean um, island chain and is located some 80 miles out of that chain. Um, and English arrived in 1625, and the first African slaves were brought to it in 1627. The evolution of and there is one more important thing, as the island is relatively small, that is Barbados is relatively small, and its open terrain allows access to all parts of the country. So it has been assumed that the slaves were completely engulfed by the dominant European culture and lost all traces of their African past. Now, another important feature of this island is Kumina, Kumina. Kumina is a ritual ceremony of singing, drumming, dancing, and spirit possession brought over from Africa to the New World by slaves. Now, its prevalence attests to the continuance and resilience of African culture in Barbados. Racially, the island is one of the most demographically homogeneous territories in the Caribbean, with more than 90% people of African descent and the rest of European or non African mixed ancestry. Now, when you are talking about the evolution of Brathwaite's poetic career, it has often been linked to that of his country. At the time when Brathwaite was growing up, Barbados was still an English colony. Brathwaite left for England in the 1950s to study history at Pembroke College, Cambridge University. He worked in Ghana for 8 years and came back to join as professor of history at the University of West Indies in Jamaica. And apart from his childhood and adolescent years, he has never stayed at Barbados for an extended period of time. And yet, the sense of being a Bajan means of belonging to Barbados, permeated his work. So, it is only appropriate to view the appearance of his first major volume of poetry, Rites of Passage, 1967, a year after the island's independence, and the poetry marking an independence of language as well. Now, Brathwaite is the author of numerous collections of poetry, including Elegus 2010, the Griffin International Poetry Prize winner Slow Houses 2005, Ancestors in 2001, Middle Passages in 1992, and Black plus Blues 1976. His first three collections, Rites of Passages 1967, Mask in 1968, and Islands in 1969, have been gathered into the Arrivals, a New World trilogy in 1973. Now, Brathwaite has worked in Ghana's Ministry of Education as well as teaching at Harvard University, the University of West Indies, and New York University. He lived in Barbados and New York City before his death in early 2020. Mia Amar Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados in the Eastern Caribbean, announced his death, calling him one of the titans of post-colonial literature and the arts. Unquote. Dr. Brathwaite's many books of poetry included Born to Slow Horses, 2005, which won the Griffin International Poetry Prize. Now the poem Negus, now let's discuss the poem Negus. Uh, it depicts the struggle against the colonial language, literature, and culture. Now, in this poem, one finds that the poet is actually shouting in the poem, it is not, it is not, it is not, it's not enough. The shouting is a kind of revolt against the influence of colonialism on the minds of Africans. Now, the poet believes that in order to negate English, they will have to affirm it first. So, hence, in this work, only words are of English language, else the structure and form are that of Africa. So, he uses English words, but the structure of the form of the poem is African. Now, the poem has developing sentences. The words used in the poem are quite easy and commonly spoken. It can be understood by every person belonging to X communities. Now, this poem, Negus, like any other poems of Kamwa Brathwaite, is meant to be sung and not to be read in order to get the meaning. Hence, it forms a part of orature or oral literature, which is native to African culture. And now, when you're looking at this poem, Brathwaite writes such a poem to defend the origin of Africa over the written literature of colonialists. And throughout this poem, what you find is a plea of bringing back the orature or oral literature, which has been lost due to the introduction of colonial education. Now, when you look at this poem is divided into two parts. In the first part, the poet stresses on the fact that are just being physically free from colonial powers, and it is not enough as they want psychological freedom as well. So, in the first part, he is talking about the physical freedom, and he says that it's not enough. They also want psychological freedom or mental freedom as well. And in the second part, the poet revolts against the colonialism and demands his language so that he may create, or so that he may create a world of his own. So that's what he is doing through this poem. And in the part one, when you're closely observing, what he says is that it's not enough to be physically free from the colonialism and from the rule of colonial powers. He wonders where is the language that was their own, and this is a kind of sigh that is made on the loss of their language, which was their identity and culture. So they consider their language as their identity and culture, and they are saying that it's not enough to be physically free, but they want to be mentally free as well. So he says, again, he repeats by saying that it's not enough to overcome the challenges of the physical life, like recovering from physical diseases like malaria, or escaping from disasters, or overcoming the fear of invasion or droughts or fire is not enough. And he says that it's not enough to go to work by ringing bicycle bells as materialism of Japan, and the technical achievements are immaterial as they take on away from their reality virtue. And he says that it's not enough to cut them, that is Africans, off from their myths, gods, past, history, etc. And it's not enough to pray to Christ, that is God of colonialists, by making a series of knocking sounds on the telephone. So that's not enough. And he says in part two, he says that in the part two, the tone changes and it moves to first person narration, that is I. He says that he must be given words in his native language so that he may be able to explain his name to trees. That is, he must be given that language, which is the language of nature. So he equates his language to the language of nature. And thus he considers the language of Africa to be close to nature and far from materialism. and he also wants to heal the future or his future from the wounds given by colonialists to their culture and language, and he wants words so that he may be able to uh, reclaim his past and bring it into existence, which was suppressed by the colonialists. So he is giving importance to his language and he wants his language back, and he is equating his language with the language of nature. So, through this language, he will create the world, the environment, the heaven, gods, ocean, and the land which he dreamt of. And thus, he wants to recreate the traditional world of the past, which was destructed by the colonial. So, though this poem appears to be very simple, throughout this poem, he is um, talking against the colonialists. And the poet also says that it's not enough to be semi colony, that is physically free but not mentally free, nor it is not enough to remain silent. So he wants full freedom. He demands freedom wholly, that is both physically as well as mentally or psychologically. He wants words that through which he would blind the god of colonialism and bring his own god instead. So he is talking about his tradition, his oral tradition, his language, his culture, his land, his nature, etc. And he says that he wants to replace the god of colonialism with his own god. So in a way, in this poem, Negus also, it's like a shout out where he talks about his freedom, his culture, and his tradition. So, in short, we can say that all these 14 poems, in one way or the other, talks about freedom, talks about alienation, talks about loss of identity, talks about their homeland, their experience of as an expatriate or immigration or whatever it is. So all these poems are in a way or the other uh, a representation of post-colonial writings, or in a way, in all these works you find one or the other post-colonial elements, and hence all these poems could be considered as a post-colonial poem. So with this we come to the end of the first session of poetry. Thank you so much.